Welcome, everyone, to another episode of PJS Dialogue. Thank you guys so much for being here. For those of you who've been following my channel, hopefully you guys have been watching some of these great interviews that I have been doing with my friends and colleagues and mentors. And I hope that you guys have been listening to a lot of the wisdom and insight that's being shared here. And I, again, just feel so lucky because not only do I get to share this with you all, but I get to learn as well for some of my friends. And today, I want to just introduce you to a friend of mine. I'll share a little bit of how we first met. It's kind of a funny story, but his name is Daniel Yang, and I want to let him just kind of give a better detailed introduction of himself. But I'm so excited about today. Again, for those of you guys who are watching this, whether it's on Facebook or on Instagram, remember I have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/PJS Center. You guys can see that at the top of the thumbnail. Go ahead and check that channel out. There's a lot of my creative kind of videos and outlet, and hopefully you guys can subscribe and just check out some of the work there. But let me bring in Mr. Daniel Yang here. All right, you guys can see him now. Daniel and I actually first met when I was church planting, and he was also church planting in Canada. And we were at something called the Send Conference in Dallas, Texas.
That's right.
And
I remember that.
it was 2013, I believe. And it was so just random. Like literally, I was there by myself. My wife couldn't come. She was invited, but she was 35 weeks pregnant, and our doctor said, that's a chance that you don't want to take. If she goes into labor on the plane, it'll be bad. So I was really sad actually because we were really looking forward to that trip. So I was very alone during that conference. And as I was walking around, I literally see this guy, Daniel, and his friend Mike. They're sitting down, and I just sat down next to them and I just started chatting with them. And Daniel, you don't know this, but I remember that conversation very
Hmm.
well till this day because I was in my kind of, I think my first year, I think I was in the middle of my first year or at the end of my first year church planting, and it was one of the hardest years of my life. I remember
Mm.
sharing with both of you guys just how tough it was. I was doing everything. I was leading worship and then preaching right after.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
remember what you said to me. I still remember to this day, you were just encouraging me and you just said to me, "Hey, you're not alone. Keep at it. Just remember that this is tough and you're not alone. Just me and Mike, we're in Canada, but connect with us anytime." And I just want to let you know that it felt so uplifting for me to hear that
Mm.
from you. And I
Wow.
still remember that. And then we actually connected again a couple years back at the 30 Network gathering. We had
That's
that
right.
gathering in Pasadena. And I think this was still before you were in Chicago, right? This was still while you were in Canada, I
I
think.
was right in the midst of transition from Toronto to Chicago. Yep.
Okay. And we
February of 2017, I think.
that's awesome. And we got to reconnect there. That was really fun. And I
Hmm.
think I shared the same story at the 30
Hmm.
Network too. But hey, Daniel, for those of you who are watching, for those people who are watching that don't know you, why don't you just give a brief kind of introduction of yourself, the ministry background,
Sure.
and your family, and kind of what you're doing right now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, John, thanks for having me on, man. I do remember us meeting in Dallas. I remember Mike and I feeling not too dissimilar to what you were feeling. I don't know if I shared this with you at the time, but church planting, of course, is lonely and it takes a lot of just perseverance. And even though Mike and I were planting together, it didn't mean that we were going to do double as well. It just meant instead of one guy being lost at sea like you were at the time, it was like two guys being lost at sea. And so but and it's amazing what God can do with the little effort that we've given. And so I'm also super excited that I have stayed in touch with you over the years. We met in Pasadena a couple years ago. The Lord continues to use you, and that's really exciting. For me, my background was that, so ethnically I'm Hmong, and I grew up in a Hmong ethnic church, and I'll kind of spare you the details unless you want to jump into those later. I eventually I was an engineer for about 9 years when the Lord called me into pastoral ministry, and it was more like He called my wife and I to becoming missionaries. And so that's how we've always kind of viewed our call as missionaries. But church planting just seemed to make the most sense in terms of what we could do in North America as missionaries. And so, that led us through a couple of different cities, Dallas, eventually Toronto, where we planted with Mike Seaman, the church that I was a part of at the time when you and I met, and we planted with same network, Send Network, and then it was probably in my fourth year of planting there that the Lord started stirring me up for uh, post grad studies, doctoral studies. It had always been on my heart to do doctoral studies. It was a matter of when, and again, we can go into how and how the Lord orchestrated that, but just felt like the calling to my PhD work was getting stronger and stronger. So in 2017, began exploring what that meant, and that really led me to ask the question, Lord, do I have to leave the ministry that we've started in Toronto? And that was a very difficult time. But long story short, so we left Toronto. And it was a very God ordained, orchestrated thing. Landed here in Chicago and started working for to direct what's called the Send Institute, and that is a partnership between the North American Mission Board and the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. And so what we do is essentially it's a think tank for church planning in North America. I work with most of the major church planning organizations and denominations and networks. We convene a group twice a year called Church Planning Leadership Fellowship. I also do a lot of think tanks and then research projects around church planting, specifically in North America. So I've been doing that for almost 3 years now, since I left Toronto. And then also am in the midst of PhD work at Trinity in my comps and dissertation phase. So that's a little bit about me, background. My wife and I, we've been married 21 years as of last week. We've got 5 children, and it's a crazy time to be stay at home with 5 kids, but we're loving it, man.
Yeah, man. I mean, you at least your kids are a little bit older than mine. I have a 4-month-old baby, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. So these guys can't take care of themselves. So it's pretty crazy. Man, I gotta ask you, man, what's it like working with Ed Stetzer? Because I know he's the head of the Billy Graham Institute over there. That guy,
Yeah,
every time he preaches for Saddleback, he's always preaching like 5,000 words per minute. But I love it. Like I'm just keeping up
yeah.
with him. But just what's it like working with him?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, he's preached at your church a couple of times, and more so recently. Man, it's been great. Ed's been a great mentor. He really is. He loves Jesus. He loves God. Has just tremendous amount of integrity. I think he's probably one of our leading thinkers when it comes to being a missiologist here in North America. And so I've really have benefited personally by just working closer to him. When you work with high capacity people, sometimes you do have to keep up. And I think that in some ways, I've had to grow as a leader, and Ed has been, just really closely, tracking with that growth. So I really continue to admire him. He's a great boss. I kind of have 2 organizations that I kind of work in tandem with, and so he's been able to be, a great, he's the kind of leader where he's very interested in what we're doing. But in this season, he's also very hands off, and he's really interested in really the vision that God's given me for the Institute. I also work with a guy named Jeff Christofferson, who, at the time when you were planting, he was the vice president of Send Network. And so it's been amazing having 2 people speak into my life and my work, both godly men, and they just love the church at large in North America. So I've grown a lot, man. I mean, I hear people talk about Pastor Rick, and I was able to spend a day with Pastor Rick back in December. He came out here to do a conference for us, and so I had the privilege to kind of just be with him and shuttle him around. And I will say this though, in terms of intensity and energy, Pastor Rick still wins hands down. I've never seen anyone with as much energy and passion as Pastor Rick. And Ed has that, and Rick has it to another level. So
Yeah, that guy, he does seriously work like crazy. He's just a workhorse. I'm
mhm.
gonna share the story till the day I die, and I don't know if Mr. Ed, Dr. Ed Stetzer's watching right now, but there's a funny story, my only claim to fame here, where I was actually doing an interview with him. I was more like a moderator for an
Hmm.
event. It was at Exponential. It was actually a 30 Network event, and
Okay.
while he was talking, I was also trying to keep time. And so I was trying to look for the right time to kind of interrupt him, but it's
Hmm.
impossible because he's talking so fast. And,
Hmm.
you could tell I was getting a little bit antsy because in the back, I have people saying like, dude, you gotta cut him off,
Keep it moving. Keep it
Right.
moving. Yeah.
And I think he noticed me getting a little antsy. And in front of everyone, he kind of stopped and he made a comment about that. And then he made fun of my hair in front of everyone because my hair was all spiky and everything.
Okay.
And I'm going to always share that story. That's my only claim to fame. Dr. Ed Stetzer made fun of my hair in front of
Uh,
everyone. It was a
that's funny.
humbling moment and it was a great moment. Well, let's try to get into this, and we're going to get into it pretty heavy here right in the beginning.
Yeah,
We
man.
had
Let's do
such
it.
an unfortunate incident. It seems like these things keep on happening,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
I want to hear your thoughts on what tragically happened to Mr. George Floyd. It's all over media. It's hard because I try my best to learn both sides because there's always two sides, and
Sure. Yep.
I want to be sensitive, and I want to be sensitive to both sides. But a part of me is also thinking what most people are thinking, which is how in on earth is this still happening? This is just so
Mm.
insane what's going on to Black Americans, African Americans, however, I don't know what the most PC way to say it, but it seems like
Mm.
it's just happening still. What are your thoughts on what happened recently, and what is some wisdom you can offer? How can Christians respond to this?
Yeah, man, I'm still processing what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis. Before I address the question that you asked, I want to provide some context for, at least for how I'm experiencing this as an Asian person, as a Hmong person, because there's some connections with Hmong people in this particular case. And then for our African American sisters and brothers that are probably, definitely today, um, mourning and grieving. The incident that happened. I think you're right. There are two sides of the story, but I think there's also a whole story that we can't neglect. It's not about sides. I think it is about the ongoing call and response of the excessive brutality that African Americans, especially African American men, experience on a more intense level. That our friends, that have represented, churches and church planting, some names that if I were to say, all would know that they have experienced racial profiling by our justice, system, for reasons that are, for you and I, we would never experience, for driving in neighborhoods or whatever. I've got friends of church planter friends, or I've got friends that are church planters that have experienced racial profiling just because they showed up to a place. So I think we have to, first of all, just admit that this is an issue. And even though there are two sides to the story, there is a more cohesive story that we all participate in. And so you can always say that, well, you never know the motivation. We didn't see the beginning of the video. We don't, all that stuff. But the reality is that this happens over and over and over again, and we have to acknowledge it. One of the nuances about this particular story that, to be honest with you, I'm just kind of raw processing it with you and your listeners. But the officer that was standing, and kind of keeping watch over the whole incident, he was an Asian American, but specifically he was a Hmong American. St. Paul, Minneapolis is actually the largest metropolis when it comes to Hmong population. And so he was a police officer. There were three on him, and then the one who had his knee on Floyd's neck is also married to a Hmong woman. She used to be actually Mrs. Minnesota, if I remember correctly. And so I feel very conflicted, and very disappointed that you have to understand the Hmong community is very small, But to know that another person of color, a minority, a person who comes from a background where we know oppression from both sides, from our home country, and then also the experience as refugee immigrants here. And again, in his mind, I'm sure he was thinking that he was doing his job, but the complicit nature of not checking his partner, not checking the other police officers, I think those kinds of things we just have to just admit, man, this is like it happened. It's there. And so I'm processing that as a Hmong person as well. I think, and then that's another layer that I think for all of us, it humanizes what's happened. It's not just a hashtag. It's not just a storyline. That there's a connection there. There's multiple layers, man. I can keep digging because there's some multiple connections within the Hmong community that are being made right now with close friends of mine, and it's a strange connection how this stuff weaves in. But I'll jump to as Christians as we're seeing this unfold, what is our response? And I think our number one response is to first of all acknowledge the violation of God in this moment. That's George Floyd was a person who was created in the image of God. That regardless of what happened, and I think the initial call was a check forgery. That his life should not have ended in that way. In that the nature of what went on, like that's not just a violation of human law; it's a violation of divine law. I think we got it, man. We got to mourn, but then we can't just stop there with mourning and grieving. I read a tweet earlier today. Relationships with somebody with a different background with you can help reduce your own personal racial bias. Like it helps with you becoming overcoming your own racist prejudice. But relationships ultimately, it doesn't change the judicial system. It doesn't change the way that these fail-safe mechanisms don't get put into place and why this continues to happen. It has to go beyond just personal relationships, and it goes beyond, it has to be action. It has to be, civic duty where this manifests itself. And so Christians need to see that they have a civic duty, by virtue of being a follower of Jesus, by virtue of obedience to the Bible, that we have a civic duty to speak against these things, to speak on these things, to provide solutions, to be there to mourn with those who mourn, but then to also work through the judicial process to make the fail-safe system better. And I think this is something that we really have to do. I'll throw one more thing in, and then John, you can keep the conversation going. But a church planter, I bring this back to church planting because that's my day in, day out reality. Church planter out in North Carolina. His name is Justin Bolden, and he's also a part of the Send Network. And he knew George Floyd. And he posted just a heartfelt tribute to George Floyd, because when he knew George Floyd, they were both in Houston, and George Floyd was a part of an outreach called Resurrection Houston. And he just humanized George's story. George was not just a hashtag. George was not just a person on a headline. He was someone who was trying to follow Jesus. He was someone who, had a life before this incident. He was a part of the church community, and people knew him. People loved him. People in our circles, think about that, John. People in our circles in the Send Network, they knew him. That should mean something to us. That should mean something to the church. And if it does, then it should mean that we should respond, very minimum in prayer, at the very minimum. But for those of us who can, at the civic level. So,
with social media, we're able to get information so much faster and quicker. And that's, for good and bad reasons.
yeah.
But I think because of social media, I think more Asians, are realizing that this is actually happening a lot. It's not just
hmm
once in a while, since again, social media, you could just get stuff so fast and so quickly. And the unfortunate things are happening with what happened with George Floyd and others. And then now we're even seeing the rise of racism against Asians because of this virus, you know? Unfortunately, it was called the Chinese flu, and a lot of people just look at you and I and assume we're Chinese. And I don't know about you, but I have friends who have been verbally just attacked and just for no reason. It's insane. And I'm not where you are. I am in California, but I'm like in the suburbs of
Hmm.
Orange County. I'm not in LA. And so maybe I don't see it or experience it as much. But what is I think as Asians, you know our culture, we like to avoid conflict. We don't want to get into stuff like that because we play it safe. We have been
Hmm.
taught from childhood to play defense our entire life. And there's so much to talk about right there. But the Asians, with what's going on with the rise of racism against Asians right now, instead of being angry, how can we respond to this? What can we do about it rather than just post a bunch of cuss words on social
Yeah.
media?
Yeah. It's a very important question. I think just in general, the racial dynamics in America have a certain way of almost like dictating our reaction to racist prejudice. And what I mean by that is, the movie Gran Torino is a
Yes.
very interesting cultural interpretation of what race looks like in America. And so essentially, in Gran Torino, the storyline is, I'm going to totally ruin the movie if you guys haven't seen it, but yeah, that's what pastors do when we use movies as illustrations. We just completely ruin it for you. But the story is centered around a guy named Walt Kowalski, who's played by Clint Eastwood. Yeah, so Clint Eastwood in the movie, he represents kind of the aging white population
Each way. Okay. Okay.
that in at least in urban context, they still have a presence, they control the structures, but they don't have a physical presence as much.
Right.
The blacks, the African Americans have more presence in these urban areas, but they don't have the decision, the authority to kind of overhaul and to really run, quote unquote, the block. And then the immigrants come in and they seem to be weakless and kind of or weak and defenseless. And so there's kind of, again, I'm not saying this is accurate. I'm saying this is how this film interprets the racial dynamics of America. And so, at the end of the film, Clint Eastwood, he dies essentially to save the immigrants. And so that really is how we interpret racial dynamics in America. Apart from Jesus, is that white people must die in order for African Americans and immigrants to have their place. I mean, I think that's some kind of the moral of the story of that movie. And I think in some ways we continue to play into that storyline because and so when the whole Chinese virus thing started happening, and there was an unleashing of this pent up anger that had already been there against immigrants, and this time it was, last few years it's been Hispanics, specifically Mexicans, and it just so happened that it was our turn now in some ways, but this pent up animosity, passive aggressiveness, this has been a part of the racial dynamics of America for a long time. Think about the LA riots in the Watts neighborhood. I mean, those racial dynamics have always been there in our cities. And so I think this became an excuse for a lot of people to unleash some of that. And depending on which city that you're in, you would, in the Midwest in particular, because Asian Americans don't have as much of a public representation. We started to see this happen quite a bit, and I think there has been a strong, unified initiative that's come out of the Midwest. It's national, but it's come out of the Midwest, led by Ray Chang and some of the folks that he's been working with, called the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And they put out a statement that I thought was very helpful. It was a theological statement, essentially, to embolden and empower Asian Americans and their friends to respond in a biblical and in a peaceful way in the midst of the rise of animosity towards Asians. And I thought that it had a really good traction. Again, but I think that the next level of Christians in the way that we engage is we have to work with our civic leaders to keep them accountable, to keep them aware of these issues that are happening. I know that this is happening in certain parts of Wisconsin, where some of the Asian community have alerted their local municipality police to know that there's a rise in aggression towards Asian members of the community, so that they can be more aware. And I think that's absolutely, that's the human thing to do. But I think as Christians, we have to think again, how has the Bible enabled us to engage civically so that we can bring greater awareness and accountability to those who actually should be keeping us safe? And I think that's really important, John. I don't want to discount quickly the fact that our job as Christians is to spread the gospel and to make disciples. I think that's our mission. If we don't do it, nobody else is doing it. But that doesn't preclude that the Bible gives us, a sense of responsibility to be responsible civic citizens, but also to keep our civic authority accountable. Then who else will? And I think we need to do that. So I think for those of us who are specifically Asians, and going back to the George Floyd incident, that it's important for us to show solidarity with other communities that are experiencing aggression. But in the midst of showing solidarity, we shouldn't lose the nuance of our experience in the midst of it, because I think that nuance of how Asian Americans experience, aggression right now in the midst of the pandemic, that needs to be highlighted. It can't be lost as well. So
I think there's some great things you shared right there because, again, even for someone like me, other than feeling guilty or feeling sad, sometimes I'm like, I really don't know what to do, you know?
right.
I think, again, because of social media, more of this is being exposed to me. Other than my own experience with racial slur as an Asian, but this is like on a whole different level. And I
Hmm.
think about a lot of Asians, I'm just curious, like, I wonder how they're responding to this. I feel like they don't really know how to respond to this other than let's just pray, which is great, I love how they're praying. But I
Yeah.
think you and I both know that, okay, but there's some other things we got to be doing except for that. But I think the
Yeah.
typical answer is like, let's just kind of pray for them and that's it. And I
Yeah.
think there's some real life application that we have to be practicing in our lives.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, a part of it is just like trying to bring an appropriate response to the appropriate people. So, for instance, when all this started happening, my brother went to Lowe's. My brother's in Detroit. He went to Lowe's and he was looking for something while he was at Lowe's, and he went to speak to one of the Lowe's workers. And immediately, when the Lowe's worker looked at him, he did this thing where he jumped, and it wasn't like they were like face to face. He was, within proper distance. He jumped away, and my brother, asked him again the second time, can you help me find this thing? And like literally, the worker just walked away, and so I think and it's pretty obvious in those. So you've experienced that experience that when somebody does that to you, that it's motivated by some kind of, I hesitate to say that he was racist, but I think in some ways his response to my brother was definitely in a reaction to an Asian person approaching him. And so, and I think in those moments, the right thing to do is, it's not like I want to get him in trouble, but it is to bring greater awareness to the managerial staff there that here you have a worker that has responded in this way, and you probably need to do better training around these issues. Likewise, so I'm not here to harp on Lowe's, all right? So I shop at Lowe's, and um, but they had a social distancing poster that they made, and I understand they used their colors, but it showed a picture of a white figure 6 feet away from a yellow figure. And again, most people, I mean, again, I don't think the designer was racially motivated. I think they were probably, I don't know, who knows why they did that. I wouldn't have done that. Most people who had any kind of racial sensitivity would probably not have done that. You and I don't claim yellow. Most Asians, we don't claim yellow. That was a color that was, bestowed onto us, I think, by the Russians at first, and eventually, the Anglos, the yellow peril, back in the 18th, 19th century. But just being sensitive to those kinds of things. And so, what I did was I just raised that up to Lowe's, and I sent an email to their department, marketing department, just to let them know that, I know that you weren't being racist, but in this given climate that we're in, it's easy to see things like this, and to think otherwise. And so I think it's those little steps that, I think, activate us. And it also works against the stereotype that you were talking about earlier, where we play the defense. I don't think it's about necessarily being passive aggressive, but I think it's important that we are actively working on behalf of all people to raise awareness of these subtle aggressions. So,
I don't want to talk a lot of detail about this, but then because I want to move on. But it's just amazing to me that today in 2020, that people will still do things that are so wrong against Asians. And I always hear this like, oh, I didn't know. I didn't know.
right.
There's that picture. I don't know if you saw it. It's like that
Yeah.
elementary school in Europe. And they had like these hats and they were like doing this with their eyes. And it's
Yeah.
crazy
Right.
that they were like, oh, we had
Yeah.
no idea that was racially insensitive. I don't want to get into that, but it's amazing how Asians, I don't know why, we are like last right now, and people still think that is not offensive. But let's move on. We don't want to get too much into
Yeah.
that. With the pandemic going on, and I'm reading a lot of what Ed Stetzer is sharing with the statistics, with Barn and all the stuff. It's so unfortunate. You probably have a better handle with church planners, but we're seeing just some scary stats with churches possibly closing, not surviving this, especially with small churches and things like that. In your research and in your experience talking with guys, where do you see the future of the church going as it slowly reopens? Dave Ferguson's talking about pivoting and doing
Hmm.
certain things, and he's still pressing the kind of things that he's doing with exponential. But I mean, everything is going to change. It has to change. And where do you see the future of the church?
Yeah. It's a great question, John. I think in the business of future predicting, it's always a little bit, of a dangerous game. We joke, we're not a profit. We work for a nonprofit. We don't make a lot of profits. So, you know, future predicting is hard to tell. I can tell you some of the things that I think are happening right now that will probably impact the short term future, and that I can also share with you some of the things that I feel are an opportunity that if we capitalize on it, it could change the future of the church. I don't, just to be clear right off the bat, I don't think this pandemic is going to get rid of large churches. I don't think it's going to get rid of even certain models of churches. I think it has shown us that we do have the propensity to be a more decentralized church if we choose to do so. And what I mean by that is that it took us a couple of weeks to go to, I mean, your church, you've been doing live streaming for a long time, so it probably wasn't a big deal. But most churches had to figure that out real quick, and they also had to figure out how to do people care in a more decentralized fashion. What I mean by that was where leading the church and caring for the church was less dependent on 2 or 3 staff people, and it became more decentralized among other people. So we have seen that more in the last 3 to 4 months, and that's a positive thing. And if we can capture that moving forward into the future, I think that actually means that more people are activated into, number one, caring for the needs of the community, the church community, and number 2, being activated in the non-church community outside of them. There's something about that I think was activated over the last 3 months that I surely hope we don't lose. If we can increase that, I don't know what that percentage is, but let's say we were only, before the pandemic, we were like at a 2 or a 3, and then the pandemic raised us to, like, let's say a 5 or a 6. that I hope that moving forward, that empowering others for the work of the ministry, if we can raise that to 7 or 9, that's, think about it. We went from a 2 to a 7. I think that'd be a fantastic thing. My I don't want to say fear, but the flip side of that is that we go back to normal, and then, or pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and now the ministry goes back to the staff and to the 2 or 3 leaders, depending on the size of your church, and then we get back to Sunday as a primary form of church. And so I wouldn't say again that I have a fear of that, but I think that's the potential, is to go back to that without capitalizing on the mobilization of so many people right now. So I think that's an opportunity right there. And
There's
then
so yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
I was going to say there's so much opportunity on the table, and I'm tweeting about that all the time. Churches need to hop on that right now. But yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. And then the second thing is, probably everybody is discovering this, is that there is a valid usage for technology, beyond just streaming services, that we've seen happen. Streaming services is definitely something that, if you hadn't done it before, you're probably going to keep doing it moving forward. But beyond streaming services, I think we've learned the value of doing uh, leadership training, online conferences, online cohorts, things that some of us had been doing before. So this is what I'm saying. Like, I don't think the large group gathering gets replaced by online gathering, but I think there should be an increase of missional training through technology that we didn't leverage before. And so one of my biggest advice to church, and we've been coaching a lot of churches and pastors through the pandemic, is to use the spring and the summer to really think about, how do we take what is our small groups ministry, and how do we actually to rethink them as like missional communities. And so where they used to be a place of assimilation, how can we release them to becoming places of mission in our community? So if you combine that concept with leveraging technology for training and for online gatherings, again, not in replacement of the in-person whenever you begin doing those again, then I think you have a training mechanism that is much more, fluid, which technology allows us to do. And then you have groups that you can activate for missional purposes and not just for assimilation. I think those two factors have a potential to create greater opportunities post the pandemic. Do I think megachurches are going to go away? No, I don't think they're going to go away. Do I think that we're going to see an increase in online churches? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But I think we discovered something these last 4 weeks. What's interesting, John, I think, is once we get into the fall, when people start gathering again at a somewhat sizable amount. Maybe not here in Illinois. They're saying we probably won't gather in groups of 50 or more until there's a vaccine. We'll see. But the fall is when we're going to really tell when people have really learned anything, or if they were just kind of waiting and hunkering down for 6 months. So we'll see.
Let's just pretend that somehow you had the opportunity to speak to like millions of people at once, like ABC, NBC. They just all had their cameras on you. And if you had the opportunity to share one message, one sermon of hope or encouragement or anything, what would you want to preach, or what would you want to say in this message?
Yeah. I'm going to try to combine all that we talked about and see if I can bring that all together. The church has survived, at least for the last 2,000 years. The church at large, the global church, has survived every pandemic, every war, every famine, like everything that has been brought on this planet in the last 2,000 years. The church has survived it. Part of the reason why the church has survived it is because the church has always been fluid, or it has learned to be fluid, and it's always been incultural. And what I mean by incultural, I mean by this: it was never ever really driven by just one culture. It was able to morph itself in whatever culture that it was in. And so I think the history of the church has shown that if you can be fluid and if you can survive in multicultural environments and not have to depend on one particular culture, then you will always innovate and become stronger in the next generation. And I really hope that for the global church, but specifically the American church. I think we have seen in the last 4 weeks the rise of racial dynamics in North America, political dynamics, which we didn't get into this conversation, but that's another conversation that we could have talked about. But that's emerging right now as churches are thinking about reopening. I mean, it's a First Amendment issue for a lot of people, right? And if the church can manage to stay either below or above the noise and still be involved in it, I think that we would see that it's the genius of why Jesus made it like durable as a fluid, multicultural institution. It's when I think it's tied too much to a particular culture, when it's tied too much to a particular political party, when it's tied too much to a particular expression. And I think the church will get itself kind of, in danger. So my hope, and I am very hopeful because the Holy Spirit leads the church, not any one particular person, that the church in North America in particular, that we will come out of this stronger. And if we manage to hear the kingdom, if we manage to see the kingdom flag over our own flags, denomination, political flags, then I think that we will have a stronger voice coming out of this. And so these are some of the things that I do think will probably make us better as we are experiencing this. It's purging some of these things out of us. And I think that that's almost essential to a better missional church on the back end. And so to that extent, I think that's what God is doing. And so I just hope that we cooperate with that. And I think I am seeing a lot of signs that we are. But it is taking some of these issues that we're seeing in the news headlines today in the last 4 weeks to remind the church to be the church and to not be so much, of the world as it is in the world. So I'll leave it at that, John.
Well, I appreciate so much for all your wisdom and insight here. Thank you for just your time. Are there any links that you want to share? I could put it in the YouTube description down below, but any links about like the Sun Network or anything that you're doing over there at the Billy Graham Institute
Sure.
that you want to share that people could connect to you with?
Yeah. If you guys would like to learn more about what we do, you can go to sendinstitute.org, and you can see, what we do. And then you can also go to coronavirusandthechurch.com, and that's some of the things that the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center we're curating in terms of what's happening in the midst of the pandemic. Ed Stetzer and I, we do a podcast. It's called Stetzer Leadership. You can go to stetzerleadership.com, and right now we're episode 30-something, and we're talking about the pandemic and how church leaders can respond.
Awesome. So you guys check out the links down below. I'm going to put it all down below in the YouTube description. These are some great places to check out, even just for that podcast alone. I'm sure there's a lot of good stuff that Daniel and Ed talk about, and I think you guys will be blessed. Daniel, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. Don't go anywhere. But thanks, guys, for watching, and I hope that you guys are all safe and healthy. Please make comments down below. Let me know what are some things that you want me and the people that I interview in the future to talk about. Maybe there's some questions that you guys want us to address, and I just hope that you all continue to stay safe and healthy. Thanks for watching, everyone.